Welcome to Propaganda in the Shadow of Totalitarianism. We have a subtitle. In Norwegian, Letting etter sannhet. In English, Search for Truth. We brought together 5 people. 3 speakers who will each speak for 20 minutes, and then we will have a panel discussion afterwards, and that will be with commentary, and hopefully there will be time for questions from the audience. My name is Terrence Baine, and I want to say a few personal things, first of all, about the people who we have invited today. First and foremost, 2 of them are from Canada, which is my hometown. Well, my home country, not my hometown. But who knows? And we have someone who's traveled all the way from Belgium, and we have someone who's traveled from Sweden, and one who has traveled not so far within Norway. I have my reading glasses here. Lesebriller, som det heter på norsk. And if I put them on now, it's basically a blur. And I got to thinking about these reading glasses, actually, because when I go to the optician, the optiker, I assume that the optiker is giving me glasses that are going to improve what I see. I must make that assumption. They do a test, and they say, these glasses will make you see the world better. Well, I got to thinking that, what if I went to a very diabolical optician, and he decided to give me a different pair of glasses that he claimed would make me see the world better. But in fact, they made me see the world the way he wanted me to see the world, the way he thought was normal to see the world. And I put on these glasses and I suddenly say, well, I'm seeing the world differently, but this is not improving what I see. Why have you done this to me? Why have you given me these glasses that has instead improved the way I see the world? It has actually made the world as if I'm seeing it through your eyes, the way you want me to see it. And I thought that that might be a nice analogy to the whole concept of propaganda. We always must ask, whose world view are we being asked to see? Who is supplying our lenses when we are trying to seek the truth? Because in my parable, if you were to call it that, or a metaphor, if the glasses obscure your view because they're glasses being provided by someone who wants you to see the world not as it is, but in what they have an interest in you seeing the world, then that is not an improvement in the sight. Each of our speakers will talk about ways that, for me, gave me ways to take off some glasses so that I could actually see a reality that maybe I had missed before. I want to welcome not first and foremost, but he will be speaking first, Mattias Desmet. He is the author of the Psychology of Totalitarianism. In Norwegian, it's called totalitarian. Oh God! It's called the Psychology of Totalitarianism. Oh, that's a hard word to say. Totalitarismens psychologi. I got it. That was a book that I read 3 years ago. And it was one pair of glasses that had been removed, a pair of glasses that actually, by taking them off, allowed me to see better. The same happened with someone I've known since, I think, 2009, Yves Engler. He wrote a book in 2009 called The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy. I was certain that I knew how Canada worked. But when I read that book, I realized that I had been seeing Canada through yet another pair of glasses that were somebody else's, that had other motives in mind. And suddenly, another filter, another veil was removed from my eyes, and I learned a lot about how Canada actually works. And I think that during the whole scandal involving Russian tampering, quote unquote, in the election of 2016, another pair of glasses was removed, media glasses that were promoting a narrative that the third speaker, Aaron Maté, revealed and coined the term Russiagate, and allowed me again to see something that I hadn't seen before. So all three of these people, for me personally, and I think for many of you in the audience who have come here, your search for reality has been made better, or you have been helped by people who have removed these glasses from people who want you to see the world the way they do, and not the way it actually is. So I would like to welcome the first speaker, Mattias Desmet.
I will not talk about propaganda. I'm sorry, Terrence. I never talk about what people want me to talk. I wrote 3 books, and 2 of them are banned by my own university. So it's a clear sign that I never talk about what people want me to talk. I have 20 minutes, isn't it? 20. Let me go back to the beginning of my academic career, back in 2003. I started working at the Faculty of Psychology then, at Ghent University. And they expected me there to write a PhD, which was like a classical research in psychology. I would investigate the associations between personality and depression. And to do that, I would measure personality traits and then measure depressive symptoms and then calculate statistical associations between the two. And I started measuring the personality traits with 3 different measuring instruments, psychological tests, let's say. And when I measured a personality trait with 3 different tests, the measurement outcomes were completely different. There was almost no correlation between the 3. So meaning that if you measure the same thing using 3 different measures, you have a completely different result. And then I measured personality with the same instrument on 3 different days. Today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. The correlation was almost 0. And I decided I won't do such research. And I asked my promoter, who still liked me at that moment. Now he published a hit piece about me 2 years ago. But then he still liked me. And I asked him, like, could I, rather than doing this research, investigate the quality of psychological research? And that was what my PhD was all about the quality of psychological research. And I published a small book about it. I got an additional master's degree in statistics because I wanted to be able to really pinpoint what the problem with psychological research was and show it in as tangible way as possible. And so I published this small book after my PhD, I guess about 10 years later. And that was the first book that was banned by my university, that I couldn't use anymore, because the students didn't want to study psychology anymore. Just because I won't go too deep into it, but while I was doing my PhD from 2003 to 2007, the so-called replication crisis started, a little bit to my surprise, and it showed that the problem I stumbled upon in psychology was also there in many other academic fields. Some of you might know this famous article of John Ioannidis, the most important biomedical statistician in the world, I think. He published this article, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, and he concludes that in certain academic domains, in particular in the medical sciences, up to 85% of the papers cannot be reproduced. That means if a certain research group does an experiment, gathers data in an experiment, and gives the data to a second research group, and the second research group reanalyzes these data, in 85% of the cases, the second research group will come to completely different conclusions than the first one. Okay? Think about that next time you believe the academic world produces science. Now, then, with my small book on the problems in psychological research, I got a little bit famous in the academic world around the world, but 90% of the people were very angry at me. And every time I tried to show them, look, it's logically impossible that a personality measure, which gives you different results on different moments, when you use it on different time points, that it measures personality, because by definition, personality refers to this set of characteristics in a human being that are stable over time. That's a definition of personality. Your personality is not supposed to change every day. Your personality refers to this set of characteristics that is stable over time. And if the personality measure is not stable, it means it doesn't measure personality. It's as easy as that. And of course, it's as easy as that. Even a small child can see it. And time and time again, I noticed that when I try to explain that to people outside of my own faculty, out of psychology, they immediately understood what I was talking about. They immediately knew, this is impossible, of course, this is stupid, and we always knew it, all these psychological tests, it's all bullshit, and so on. That's a little bit exaggerated, but anyway, everybody who doesn't identify with psychology understands that immediately. But when I tried to tell it to people from the world of psychology, from the academic world of psychology, they just got angry, and they refused to see the simple truth that even a small child could see. And that was the moment where I really got interested in how very intelligent people, because most of my colleagues are intelligent people, I believe, can become extremely stupid under certain conditions. And I noticed that you cannot explain this strange expert blindness, as it is sometimes called, that you cannot explain it through individual psychology alone. You need to understand the impact of group psychology, of the group on an individual human being. Yeah, and then the Corona crisis started in 2020, and from the first week onwards, took a look at the statistics. I was one of the people who were best trained, I think, to detect flaws in statistical research because of my PhD, because of the fact that I was both a psychologist and a statistician. I took a look at the statistics, the statistics on the mortality rates of the virus, and from the first week onwards, I said these statistics are wrong. They overrate the mortality of the virus by a factor 10. And I published immediately, in the first week of the crisis, a paper in Belgium titled The Fear of the Virus is More Dangerous Than the Virus Itself. That paper went viral, to use a word that is a little bit dangerous in this context, but the paper went viral. Even national television published it on its website. And that was the last paper they ever published of me. After that, they only published fact checks about me. But in the beginning, there was still this little space of doubt. And national television published it, several newspapers published it. And but, of course, as we know, the statistics nevertheless became the basis of the corona measures worldwide. And by the end of May 2020, it was proven beyond a shade of a doubt that indeed the initial statistical models had been dramatically overrating the dangerousness of the virus. These statistics predicted that in a small country such as Sweden, by the end of May 2020, 60,000 people would die if the country didn't go into lockdown. And by the end of May 2020, Sweden hadn't gone into lockdown and only 6,000 people died, which indeed more or less confirmed my initial assessment that the mortality rate was 10 times lower. And then it's even more clear, like in June 2020, I think, the people who constructed the initial models of Imperial College, in a hearing before the House of Commons in Great Britain, just admitted in a touching, honest way that their initial statistics had been completely off. That the mortality was much lower than their initial statistics predicted. And the interesting thing from a psychological point of view was, even then, the narrative just continued as if all the initial statistics had been absolutely accurate. Yeah. And then I decided to use a different strategy. I said, like, okay, I will stop trying to show people that the statistics were wrong because that doesn't work. I will try to bring to their attention the psychological mechanisms that explain how an entire society can go along, buy into a narrative that is clearly, from many respects, utterly absurd. And I started to write about a phenomenon called mass formation. Mass formation, I believe, is something, as I said, it's not about propaganda. Not in the first place. It's about what makes people so vulnerable for propaganda. This phenomenon of mass formation is a phenomenon that is the psychological basis of so-called totalitarian states. It's very important to understand that a totalitarian state, I believe, we are now witnessing the emergence of a new totalitarianism. Not a fascist, not a communist, but a technocratic totalitarianism. A kind of totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt, the most important philosopher on totalitarianism, anticipated in 1953 when she said, "We've seen the collapse of fascist totalitarianism. We will soon witness the collapse of communist totalitarianism, but we will also soon see the emergence of a new totalitarianism, a totalitarianism which is not led by gang leaders such as Stalin or Hitler, but by dull bureaucrats and experts." That's what we are witnessing now. I always wondered, before I was writing my book, how she could know that back then. But in the end, I believe it's not too difficult to see why she knew it. But I won't tell it now. You have to read my book for that. And I don't have time enough. But, totalitarianism is something completely different than a classical dictatorship. In a classical dictatorship, the psychological mechanism is very simple. There is a small group of people whom people experience as having a huge aggressive potential, and consequently they just accept that this small group of people unilaterally imposes its social contract to the population. In a totalitarian state, you have a completely different psychological mechanism. In a totalitarian state, you first have the emergence of a mass formation, a process through which a certain part of the population, usually 20 to 30%, fanatically starts to believe in a certain ideology or narrative, so fanatically that they become completely incapable of taking a critical distance of what the group believes in. 2, so fanatically that they are willing to radically self-sacrifice, to sacrifice everything. And 3, they believe so fanatically in the narrative that they become radically intolerant for people who think and speak differently. And at the end stage of this process of mass formation, you see something baffling. You see that people become so intolerant that mothers start to report their children to the state, and children start to report their parents to the state if they believe the other is not loyal enough to the state narrative. There is this conversation of me on the internet with a woman of Iran, Shoref Eshtari, a woman who lived in Iran during the revolution there of 1978, 1979, which was actually a huge mass formation in Iran. And when she was there, she was forced to witness, because she was the daughter of the mayor, she belongs to the upper class of Iran, she was forced to witness on a Friday evening how a mother who reported her son to the state put the noose around his neck, and when he died on the scaffold, she was proud to receive a medal for heroineship. That's a dramatic end stage of a mass formation. Yeah. So if we want to avoid that dramatic end stage of a mass formation, we have to try to understand what mass formation is, because once you understand the mechanism, you can clearly see what you can do to go against this and what you definitely should not do. In a nutshell, how much time is left? 10 minutes, okay. In a nutshell, 12. Good. So, in a nutshell, I believe that, or at least the analysis I present in my book, and which I discussed on many podcasts, I believe that the root cause of a totalitarianism and the phenomenon of mass formation has to be situated in our materialist, rationalist view on man in the world. We could see how as soon as the materialist view on man in the world, the rationalist view on man in the world, the idea that the entire universe is like a machine which can be perfectly understood in a rational way, where the essence of life can be grasped in a rational way, and where the rational thinking rather than ethical principles should be the guiding principle in human living together. Well, this view on man in the world produced, on the one hand, propaganda. I won't go into that because other people might do it this evening, or maybe I can do it later. On the one hand, it produced propaganda, but even more important, it created a condition that makes people so vulnerable for propaganda. It made people feel lonely and disconnected, or in the terms of the German philosopher Hegel, who observed this phenomenon already in the beginning of the 19th century, it atomizes society. It makes society breaking apart in all separated, isolated individuals. And just before the corona crisis, for instance, in 2017, we could see that this process of the atomization of society peaked. Like in 2017 in the Gallup World Poll, more than 40% of the people worldwide reported to be so lonely that they didn't have one meaningful relationship and that they only connected with other people through the internet. So there was a real loneliness epidemic, as described by, among many others, the US Surgeon General at that moment, and Theresa May in Great Britain even appointed a Minister of Loneliness, which of course didn't help. But this loneliness is the existential precondition for the emergence of totalitarianism, because once people feel lonely and disconnected, they will typically be confronted with so-called lack of meaning-making and purpose in life. They will feel their life is without purpose. You can also, I describe the mechanisms in my book, but you could see that also that phenomenon peaked. Like in a very interesting book called Bullshit Jobs, David Graeber, an anthropologist who died sadly enough 3 years ago, describes how between 40 and 60% of the people experiences their own work, their own job as a bullshit job, a job without meaning or purpose. That's one illustration of how widespread the experiences of lack of meaning-making and purpose in our society were and are. And then, so once people feel lonely, disconnected, or confronted with lack of meaning-making, they will experience typical changes at the level of their emotional and affective functioning. They will be confronted with what I called free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. That means a kind of frustration, aggression, and anxiety which they cannot connect to a mental representation. In other terms, they will feel frustrated, aggressive, and anxious without knowing what they feel frustrated, aggressive, and anxious for. And that's where propaganda comes in, or narratives comes in. If under these conditions someone distributes a narrative, intentionally or unintentionally, doesn't matter, through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety and providing a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, there is a good chance that all this free-floating anxiety will at once connect to the object of anxiety, and that people will be willing to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, even if that strategy is utterly absurd. Just because in this way they have the feeling that they are in control of their anxiety again, and that they can take out all their frustration and aggression that was piling up inside of their psychological system and project it to another object. So that's a first step. It's a first step, because which delivers like a certain psychological advantage. And then a second step happens, which is even more important. Because so many people at the same time participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, the witch hunts for the witches, the crusades for the Muslims, the concentration camps for the Jews and so on, or the lockdowns for a virus. Once people start to buy into this narrative, this strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, they start to have the feeling that they fight a heroic collective battle. In other words, they feel as if they escape their loneliness, their lonely state, which was the most profound problem, psychologically speaking. I said, they feel as if they escape their loneliness, because they do not really escape it. And that's the point. A mass is a group that is formed in a different way than a normal group. A normal group emerges when people individually connect to each other, when they love each other a little bit, when they feel solidarity a little bit, from individual to individual. A mass emerges in a different way. In a mass, an individual does not connect to other individuals. Each individual separately connects to a collective ideal. Meaning that, and the longer the mass formation lasts, the more all the solidarity, all the love between individuals is sucked away and is all injected in the bond between the individual and the collective, meaning that after a while, the bond with the collective becomes much stronger than the bond with even the strongest bonds with other individuals, even stronger than the bond between a mother and their child. And that's why even mothers start to report their children to the state in long-term mass formations. So, that's the bad news. We could see it emerge, I believe, in the Corona crisis. I don't say there was a virus and so on, but the kind of solidarity that emerged showed this strange totalitarian characteristics. Because, like in the Corona crisis, everyone was talking about solidarity, but at the same time, we accepted that if someone got an accident on the street, we were no longer allowed to help that person, unless we had surgical gloves and surgical masks at our disposal, which is almost never. So you see, because of the solidarity with the collective, you cannot show solidarity anymore with another individual. The same applies to the elderly who were dying in hospitals and whom couldn't be visited by their children, for instance. Now you see this strange solidarity emerging there as well. So the point is, if you wonder like what you can do about it, and we could see, I think, like when the Corona crisis ended in 2022, or when the measures disappeared, in the same week we could see the emergence of what I believe to be a new mass formation. The Ukraine narrative became dominant. Immediately, as soon as the aggression, the anxiety, the frustration is taken away from one object, it tries to find a new object to attach to, because otherwise people will be confronted again with all the problems they were confronted with before the mass formation happened. So that's a dramatic dynamic in mass formations. Mass formations emerge because the population feels lonely, but it creates even more loneliness, even more frustration, even more aggression, making it usually go until the bitter end, which means a lot of destruction. So what can we do about it? That's very important. Well, it's very clear. In Belgium and Holland, they give these workshops in sincere speech, because in the end you can clearly see that only the sincere speech of everyone who doesn't fall prey to a certain mass formation can stop the mass formation, or can at least make sure that it doesn't go to the ultimate stage where the masses start to destroy everyone who doesn't go along with them. Gustave Le Bon, who wrote the first important book about mass formation, La Psychologie des Foules, the psychology of the crowd, observed that already in the beginning of the 20th century. He said, when there is a mass formation, there will always be a group of people who doesn't fall prey to it. And a small part of that group will decide that they want to speak out. They will try to wake up those in the masses and show them how absurd the narrative was they bought into. And these people, he said, will typically be disappointed. They will just see that it is impossible to wake up the masses. No rational argument at all is capable, usually, to show someone who is in a mass formation that he is in a mass formation. And but he said, Gustave Le Bon said, but that doesn't mean that the voice of the dissonant people who speak out, the dissonant voices, have no effect. They do have an effect. If these people continue to speak out, you will usually see that the mass formation doesn't go to the last very destructive phase. So it's a very extremely important to speak out. And I see that you start to move, Terrence. I think I have to stop, isn't it? Give me 2 more minutes, okay? Yeah. I forgot what I wanted to say. Okay, yes, well, history just shows that we should speak out. Like like in 1930, in the Soviet Union, the resistance stopped to speak out. 6 months later, the cruelty started. In 1935, exactly the same happened in Nazi Germany. So it's just quintessential to continue to speak out, not in no matter what way. You have to try to speak out in a sincere way. That means never try to convince the other too much. Just testify to what you feel inside. Never claim that you are the one who possesses the truth. Nobody possesses the truth. But just stick to your right to articulate your own opinion in an as calm way as possible. Usually that is what works best. It's a simple sincerity, which is the only remedy against emerging mass formations. Anyway, okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mattias. We're so happy that our next speaker is coming here in person and not appearing in a Zoom call on a big screen. Could everybody give a warm welcome to someone who, for many of you in this audience, needs no introduction, Aaron Maté.
Thank you, Terrence. And thank you, Terrence, and everyone else who helped organize this event. It's great to be here with you. I'm very thrilled to be in Oslo. I'll just move this out of the way. I work as a journalist, and I sort of try to make it my mission to be useful in our media system. Rather than repeat all the lies of state power that are used to justify wars, sanctions, things that make ordinary people around the world suffer. I try to cut through the propaganda that helps sustain so many of these global crimes. And there's a lot of propaganda to expose. And today I'll talk about some of the conflicts that I've tried to stay on top of and try to offer some insights into the nature of our propaganda system. The first thing to say about our propaganda system is that it really works very well. It's pretty brilliant. You know, as was mentioned earlier, it's not a totalitarian system where someone is telling everyone what to say and everybody falls in line. The way our system is established, and this applies in the US where I live, but also I think here in Europe, is that given that our media is concentrated in the hands of the same people who run our society, everyone who works inside that media system just intuits, without being explicitly told, that if they want to advance, if they want to be a part of a group, you know, as Mattias discussed, then they just know what they will say and cannot say. And if you want to get ahead, you'll be rewarded by conforming and by repeating so many of the demonstrable lies that sustain the policies of people in power. Well, where is this propaganda system, I think, most destructive, or at least most cynical? Well, to me, it starts with what I think is one of the worst crimes in human history unfolding before our eyes, which is Israel's mass murder campaign in Gaza. This is now a more than a year and a half long genocide, ethnic cleansing, and now, for the last 80 days, a full-blown starvation campaign against 2 million people trapped in a defenseless death camp. How does our propaganda system work here? Well, first of all, if you read the media, there's so many examples of Western headlines in a passive voice, not applying agency to the latest Israeli crime. If there's an Israeli bombing of a hospital, then it's something passive along the lines of, 17 die in bombing, in strike. We don't know who the strike came from, as if it might have appeared magically from the sky. So denying agency to the perpetrator, which is Israel. And then there's just the complete normalization of some of the most unspeakable crimes. So, for example, this now 80-day full-on starvation siege of Gaza, in which Israel has blocked all food and fuel from coming into Gaza, leading to warnings of famine and thousands of babies dying. Now, recently, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, he's relented a little bit. He said on Sunday that he would allow a basic quantity of food. But he immediately admitted, and this speaks to how important propaganda is, that he immediately admitted this was for propaganda purposes, to let Western governments, especially the U.S., continue to sustain his campaign to ethnically cleanse Gaza. Netanyahu said this: "Our best friends in the world, senators I know as strong supporters of Israel, have warned that they cannot support us if images of mass starvation emerge. They come to me and say, we'll give you all the help you need to win the war, but we can't be receiving pictures of famine. Therefore," he added, to continue carrying out his campaign against Gaza, quote, "we need to do it in a way that they won't stop us." And that's a great way to characterize our propaganda system. We need to do it in a way so that the public is sufficiently pacified so that they won't stop us. Because obviously these senators who Netanyahu was talking about, they don't care about the mass starvation. They care about the images of mass starvation. And those images reach the taxpayers footing the bill for Israel's mass murder campaign, because it's all of our governments, it's here too, but especially the U.S. that sustains Israel's policies. Without the U.S. and without the support of NATO governments at large, Israel could not be carrying out what it's doing. The Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, he likewise explained that allowing in a trickle of aid will, quote, "allow our friends in the world to continue to provide us with an international umbrella of protection." That's right. A trickle of aid that then can be used to avoid a full-blown famine, which can be kept off the front pages of newspapers, that will allow the ethnic cleansing crisis to continue. And that's exactly what Israel wants to do. It's so obvious. That's how Israel was founded. It was founded on ethnic cleansing. The people of Gaza, most of them are either refugees who used to live in what is now Israel that were ethnically cleansed in 1948, or are the descendants of those refugees. And this latest phase of Israel's 77-year war on the Palestinians is simply meant to finish the job and ethnically cleanse those remaining 2 million people in Gaza so that they go even further away from what is now Israel, from the land that Israel stole from them. Israeli politician Moshe Feiglin, he recently summarized the policy. He said, "Every child, every baby in Gaza is an enemy. The enemy is not Hamas. We need to conquer Gaza and colonize it and not leave a single Gazan child there." Well, if you watch media coverage in the West, yes, sometimes they report on these extremist statements. But the way it's presented is, this is an aberration. The extremists in Israel, they don't represent the full spectrum of the government. And even if there's criticism of Netanyahu sometime, they ignore the fact that even people who are more liberal than Netanyahu in the political spectrum fully support his policies. They just object to the way that he's carried it out, which includes, by the way, sacrificing the remaining captives, the remaining hostages, because Israel, as it's shown throughout its history, has no interest in protecting its own people. Its foundational commitment is to supremacy and hegemony. How has this been waged? How has this been marketed to a Western public? Well, if I can offer some psychological insight here, it's the way Israel and its apologists have carried this out is by appealing to some of our worst fears and our best values to justify carrying out some of the most evil atrocities in history. So, for example, after October 7th, the Western public was bombarded with a wave of propaganda. And I'm not sure how extreme it was here, but I suspect it was substantial. Certainly in the US, we heard nonstop claims about atrocities that didn't happen. Now, to be clear, there were atrocities by Palestinian militants on October 7th. They killed civilians. They kidnapped innocent people, including babies, which is a full-blown war crime atrocity, deserves all the condemnation in the world. But Israel and its apologists weren't content letting the public know what was true, what was documented. They also came up with a series of lies. There was the claim about dozens of beheaded babies, for example. And our media is so subservient that when CNN got this claim from the Israeli government, they said it was confirmed. And they said it was confirmed because the Israeli government told them that it happened. They didn't bother to ask for evidence, which is the basic premise of being in the news business. Unless you want to be a state propagandist, you ask for evidence before saying anything, especially such an explosive allegation like that. There also was the mass rape claim that Hamas carried out mass rape on October 7th. And everybody went along with this. Everybody. Because who wants to be the person to say, where's the evidence for rape? That's a very sensitive allegation. And, when I was asking myself this question, where's the evidence for this claim? When Israel put it out, this was in November 2023, and it really started picking up steam. And that was at a point when Israel was under a lot of pressure because it had been killing by that point thousands of people, and it started attacking hospitals and was committing all these unspeakable atrocities before our eyes. And that's when we saw ramping up this allegation that Hamas committed mass rape on October 7th. So when I was asking myself, where's the evidence for this? I felt uncomfortable. And I understood then how this works. They put out these allegations that speak to our best nature, that are uncomfortable to challenge, and they basically want to intimidate you into silence so that they can carry out the actual atrocities before our eyes. And that was the case with this mass rape allegation. Still today, one and a half years later, there still isn't, I have no problem saying this, there not only isn't any evidence for mass rape, there isn't actually any evidence for a single case of rape on October 7th. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. I'm not God. I wasn't there, so it doesn't mean it didn't happen. But before you repeat a claim, you have to have at least some evidence for it, and there's none. Israeli officials admit there's no forensic evidence, there's no physical evidence, there's no audio or visual evidence, there's no survivors. The only thing they have are claims from purported witnesses that have all sorts of contradictions. And the most glaring example of this was there was a front page story in the New York Times in December 2023. It made a huge splash. Everybody was sharing it. This is horrible. How could Hamas do this? And they used as the poster child of sexual violence an Israeli woman who was killed on October 7th named Gal Abdush. And that was, she was called by the Times the symbol of sexual violence on October 7th. Well, there was one problem. Her family immediately came out and said that this was not true because they had spoken to her right before she was killed. And there was no way, they said, that she was sexually assaulted or raped. The New York Times didn't care. And there were so many other holes in their stories, including witnesses who were so-called witnesses whose claims were later shown to be false. The New York Times didn't care, and nobody bothered to challenge this story in the corporate media. The ones who did were a few of us in the Fringe, myself and Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone, Ali Abu Nima at the Electronic Intifada, a few others. But everybody else went along. And still to this day, when Western politicians get up and talk about why we have to keep supporting Israel, you will still hear this claim invoked because Hamas raped women on October 7th. And that's how atrocity propaganda works. Playing on our worst fears and our deepest, strongest values to commit the worst evil in the world. Another way the propaganda system works is simply erasing the background. So context all of a sudden disappears. All of a sudden, history began on October 7th. There's no context before that. There's no Israeli military occupation that began in 1967, one of the longest running military occupations in the world. There's no medieval siege of Gaza in which Israel has imposed for 20 years a siege of Gaza in which it controls everything that gets in and out. In the words of Israeli officials, they put the people of Gaza on a diet. by controlling how many calories they can consume. There's no great march of return. This is in 2018 when Palestinians did what everyone's been telling them they should do, which is commit nonviolence, nonviolent resistance. Thousands of Palestinians in Gaza in 2018 marched peacefully at the border with Israel. Israeli snipers gunned them down, maimed people, left people paralyzed, killed people, including journalists and paramedics, and the world yawned. The world didn't care. There's no context in which actually Hamas has said they would accept the international consensus of a two-state solution. That's the solution everybody supposedly agrees on. It's a big compromise for Palestinians, accepting just 22% of their historic homeland with a state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Hamas leaders at times have said that they would accept that. It's Israel and the U.S. that have stood alone in the world in refusing to even accept that Palestinian compromise and insist on Israel's self-declared right to colonize as much Palestinian land as they want, particularly in the West Bank, which is now just littered with Israeli settlements that make any Palestinian state absolutely impossible deliberately. You know, the cynicism of this was recently underscored by the former Israeli defense minister Yoav Gallant, who's now there's an ICC warrant for his arrest for the war crimes in Gaza, and he admitted that one of Hamas's aims on October 7th was trying to force Israel to accept that two-state solution that the whole world supports. He said that, quote, Hamas were speaking about Israel withdrawing from the West Bank, about how to divide Jerusalem in return for a hostage deal. So what Gallant is saying is Hamas was basically saying to Israel, we want a compromise. We want a state of our own and just 22% of the land that you stole from us. But that context is never mentioned in establishment media. You can't acknowledge that Hamas actually has a more accommodating attitude on a two-state settlement than Israel or the U.S. does. It's always them. They won't accept our existence. They want to wipe us off the map. We can never make peace with them, and therefore we have to go ahead and destroy a besieged death camp of 2 million people. Sometimes, though, the corporate media admits the truth. And that's because, you know, we do live in a relatively free society where sometimes the facts can get out, although they're always buried at the bottom. But also because media does serve a privileged audience. The media is full of privileged people. It's owned by privileged people. And therefore, privileged people sometimes want to know the facts. And they want to have an understanding of how the world works. So sometimes, you know, these establishment outlets can convey accurately what the real goals are. So the New York Times did this when it comes to Israel. So as the New York Times was constantly printing claims about how Israel's right to self-defense and we have to, Israel, you know, what choice does Israel have but to go and destroy Gaza because Hamas launched this awful terrorist attack and there's no alternative. The New York Times admitted the truth, and it came via U.S. officials that they interviewed. And this was back in November 2023, and this is what the New York Times said. The Americans say that Israel's forceful response reflects the importance that it places on reestablishing deterrence against attacks from adversaries in the region. The Israeli military's aura of power was shaken by the October 7th attack, the officials say. And that's exactly right. This is not about defending yourself and living in peace. This is about defending your aura of power. And you need your aura of power if you're a colonizer. And if the people you're colonizing rise up against you, they have to be taught a lesson. If they're going to challenge your aura of power, if they're going to shake your aura of power, to use the New York Times terminology, they have to be destroyed, along with all the civilians that live alongside them. And that's what Israel's doing right now with our support, continuing to defend its aura of power by carrying out mass murder in a defenseless death camp. And by the way, this goes back to Israel's founding. Israel's always recognized that if it wants to maintain its status as a ethno-supremacist state, it has to constantly engage in violence and make the lowly Arabs that who lived there first scared of us. So, for example, in 1967, Israeli Ariel Sharon, who went on to become one of Israel's most notorious prime ministers, military leaders, he said that Israel's deterrence capability, its main weapon is the fear of us. So deterrence is not by making peace. It's not by having relations with our neighbors. It's instilling fear in the indigenous Arabs that we live around and that we've colonized. And that's the policy that Israel has pursued, and that's the policy that our propaganda system defends. I could say a lot more about Gaza, but I want to get to other issues as well. The Ukraine war. also accompanied by, as Mattias mentioned, a huge onslaught of propaganda that requires, first of all, painting a caricature of Vladimir Putin and Russia as hell-bent on conquest of not just Ukraine, but all of Europe next. And we've been flooded with that. And also erasing all the factual context. And there's so much to go through. It's, you just cannot mention some of the basics. So just to summarize it briefly, end of the Soviet Union, there's an informal agreement between Moscow and the West that NATO will not expand further to the east. It's true that the Soviet Union never secured a formal written guarantee of this pledge, but there's so much documentary evidence that this pledge was made that NATO will not expand further into closer to Russia's borders. And even if, you can argue, okay, well, listen, there is no formal treaty, so NATO wasn't bound to do that. The question is, why should NATO do that? Why is it advantageous? Why does it help anybody's security to keep expanding a hostile military alliance towards the borders of the world's other top nuclear power? Well, the answer was given in private by the Clinton administration in 1994 when they privately authorized a policy of seeking to expand NATO, and including into former Soviet states like Ukraine. And this is the members of his National Security Council wrote this, that the U.S. will push for moving NATO into former Warsaw Pact states, including Ukraine, on the basis of a, quote, insurance policy strategic hedge rationale, which it defined as the neo-containment of Russia. So, and they also said, but this goal will be kept in the background only. Well, why was that important to say this will be kept in the background only? Because they knew if you go to the public and say, hey, we're going to keep expanding this military alliance for the goal of the neo-containment of Russia, first of all, Russia might think, hey, this wasn't what we agreed to end the Cold War, and also this is a threat to our security. And meanwhile, the Western public that is footing the bill for all this might get the idea that maybe this isn't good for us either, to have a hostile military alliance premised on the neo-containment of another nuclear power. So rather than that, we get flooded with claims that NATO is about defending peace and freedom, and it doesn't want conflict with Russia, and so forth. And it works. But ultimately, we have a conflict breakout over this, not in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, but I would argue in 2014. 8 years earlier, when the U.S. backed a coup in Ukraine. And there again, we were flooded with propaganda about what happened, that this was not a coup, this was a peaceful uprising of democracy-loving people against a Russian-loving dictator, Yanukovych, and who was ousted in a movement for closer ties to the West. It's true there were massive protests against Yanukovych. It's true there were many people outraged by corruption in his government and who wanted to have closer ties to the West. But we weren't told many things. We weren't told that actually the country was deeply divided. Half the country supported the Maidan about. The other half of the country, and some polls say even a majority of the country, did not. We were not told that a year before the Maidan coup, the European Parliament warned that nobody should be associating with the Svoboda Party, which turned out to be one of the main drivers of the Ukrainian coup, because they have xenophobic, anti-Semitic views. Well, fortunately for Svoboda and the other people behind the Ukraine coup, they won the support of a more important constituency inside Ukraine for Ukraine's fate, which is the U.S. government. The U.S. saw an opportunity with the Maidan to push its longstanding project to pull Ukraine into NATO. And this leads to a coup. This leads to a war breaking out in the Donbass, where the people of eastern Donbass launched a Maidan of their own. Their government was overthrown. They had voted overwhelmingly for Yanukovych. The new government was cracking down on Russian culture, and they revolted with the backing of Russia. Rather than help end the crisis, the U.S. came in and encouraged the new coup government to launch an offensive against the Donbass, which leads to war. This leads to the Minsk Accords of 2015, which were premised on the coup government granting some limited autonomy to the people of eastern Ukraine, recognizing their rights as ethnic Russians, their desire to speak Russian, their desire to elect their own officials, have their own judges. But two important constituencies that stood in the way of the Minsk Accords, and that again was the same coalition that drove the 2014 coup, the far right of Ukraine, the same people that the European Parliament had once warned about, and again, the U.S. government. And they aligned to make sure that this war could continue. The U.S. government, for the same purpose, they wanted to keep the project of NATO alive in Ukraine, which also had the benefit of bleeding Russia, because by drawing Russia into Ukraine, you have a proxy war. As U.S. strategists even talked about, there's a famous RAND paper, which RAND is a Pentagon-tied think tank, which talked about the most effective way to bleed Russia is to arm Ukraine, because Russia will be forced to double down its efforts and intervene, which is exactly what has happened. Again, context that we never hear about in our media. We also never hear about the fact that after Russia invaded Ukraine, there were immediate peace talks that began between Ukraine and Russia, which culminated in the Istanbul Accords of April 2022, a tentative deal brokered between Russia and Ukraine. That peace deal collapsed, though, after Zelensky walked away. And the reason we got at the time was because the Ukrainian forces had discovered Russian atrocities in the town of Bucha, and also Russia was trying to basically neuter Ukraine as a country. And that also was the dominant narrative throughout Western media, especially inside the U.S. Well, there's some inconvenient facts that get in the way of that. First of all, even after the Bucha atrocities, and whatever you think about what happened there, it's not something I've looked into, but let's assume all the allegations against Russia there are true. Even after the Bucha atrocities, Zelensky made the argument, a very accurate one. He said, if we want more atrocities like this to stop, we have to make peace. So the argument now that Ukraine couldn't make peace because of the Bucha atrocities never made sense, because the best way to stop atrocities is to end the war, which Ukraine could have done in Istanbul with the peace deal. Another problem is that Ukrainian officials started admitting that actually they had reached a deal that they were on board with until Boris Johnson of the UK came over and said, we're not going to back you up. And Alexander Chali, who is a Ukrainian diplomat, he even said that we managed to reach a very real compromise in Ukraine, and Putin did everything possible to make peace. One time in the New York Times, that statement has been reported, once. Otherwise, though, all we get is that the Istanbul talks were collapsed because of Bucha and because Russia was effectively demanding that Ukraine surrender its sovereignty. Even though top Ukrainian negotiators admitted there was a very real compromise. The problem was, as Ukrainian officials also admitted, was that Boris Johnson told Zelensky, if you reach this peace deal with Russia, we're not going to back you up. And we can have security guarantees with you, but not on any deal that involves Russia. And by the way, Alexander Chali, the Ukrainian negotiator, also admitted that after Ukraine walked away, Zelensky went back to the US and the UK and said, okay, how about those security guarantees that you promised us? And the message was, yeah, we're not going to do that, but we'll give you security by continuing to give you weapons. So in other words, we're going to continue to flood you with weapons to bleed Russia, which also was admitted as the goal. That for all the talk about defending democracy and stopping Putin here, U.S. officials and Western officials couldn't help themselves in admitting, actually, the goal here is to weaken Russia. That was the admission by Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary under Biden. And in fact, Joe Biden called Lloyd Austin and reprimanded him for saying it. And U.S. officials admitted that Biden wasn't mad that Austin had said something wrong. He had said something true. He was just upset that he'd said something publicly. Because to sustain these conflicts, to sustain these proxy wars, we have to be flooded with claims that we're there to defend democracy and freedom and to stop Putin from moving on to the next NATO state. Let me say something about Syria, another conflict that has been just an area of just mass propaganda. In 2011, you do have an uprising begin against a longtime authoritarian leader, Assad. Again, yes, there were genuine grievances there. I have friends who went to the streets against Assad, against his political repression. They wanted freedom of speech. They wanted an end to corruption. The problem is, and this is similar to Ukraine, that sort of peaceful, secular element, pro-democracy feeling was not the only element. There also was a heavy sectarian element that was not just against corruption and repression from the government. It actually was based on sectarian division. So people were chanting in these sectarian protests, Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. And that Sunni sectarian element of the protests was the one that the U.S. and their allies got behind, because they saw an opportunity to take advantage of a conflict to advance their hegemony. Syria was a part of the axis of resistance in the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. Syria played an important role in providing weapons to Hezbollah, which helped prevent Israel from achieving its goals in that war. And that's when the Bush administration marked Syria for regime change and went into effect to bring it about in partnership with some of the Sunni Gulf states. And that sectarian element is the insurgency that the U.S. and their allies helped fund. That's why Jake Sullivan infamously wrote to Hillary Clinton in a 2012 email, "Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria." And because Al-Qaeda was on our side in Syria, our side ultimately won. Even when the U.S. stopped providing weapons, the U.S. continued to impose crippling sanctions that made Syria's economy impossible to function. Poverty jumped to 90% of the country. Before the war, Syria was a relatively stable country in terms of health indicators, self-sufficient in food, a pretty decent health system for the region, a really good education system for the region. All that was destroyed under the war, the dirty war, and further decimated under sanctions, along with a U.S. military occupation that stole most of Syria's fuel and wheat. And so, the combination of years of war, the sanctions, and the military occupation finally led to a collapsed state for Assad, who ultimately fled. And now that the damage has been done, the regime change is over, now the sanctions can go. And funnily enough, last week Trump said he's going to lift the sanctions on Syria. And it's a great thing. It's a wonderful thing that Syrian people will no longer be targeted by sanctions. And he said something interesting. He said that the sanctions were brutal and crippling, but he said they served an important function. And he's right. Impoverishing a whole people and subjecting them to sanctions that raise the prices of bread and fuel and all the basics of life and cutting them off from the global system, it did serve an important function. And the question should be asked, which is never asked in our system, why were those sanctions imposed in the first place? If we're against authoritarianism, who elected us to impose policies on the Syrian people that prevent them from having the basics to live? That sounds very authoritarian to me, to say that we are going to give ourselves the right to make you suffer because we want to overthrow your government. That to me is the definition of authoritarianism, but it's never defined that way because we always claim to be doing it in the interests of democracy and freedom. And to advance this agenda, by the way, just last comment, there was a major propaganda campaign around the issue of chemical weapons. Again, a very sensitive issue. And there's system became created where if you challenge allegations of chemical weapons by the Syrian government, you're a denier. You're a chemical weapons center. How could you deny these horrible atrocities? Well, the reason why you could question them is because these allegations were used to advance the dirty war. They were used to help manufacture consent for bombing Syria, and because the available evidence undermined them. To advance these allegations, the U.S. media had to ignore leaks that came out of the U.S. government in multiple times, and they also had to ignore a massive cover-up scandal at the OPCW, the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, in which two chemical weapons inspectors who deployed to Syria to investigate one of the alleged chemical attacks in Douma in April 2018, which led to U.S. military strikes. These whistleblowers alleged that their investigation had been covered up and censored, and that their actual probe had found no evidence that there was a chemical attack by the Syrian government, and that the available evidence pointed to this being staged on the ground by insurgents, which actually made sense, because why would Assad do the one thing that he knew would invite a U.S. military strike, which was a chemical weapons allegation? That was Obama's so-called red line, which Trump wanted to enforce to show he was better than Obama, that if Syria uses chemical weapons, that's when we'll bomb Syria. And so the media try to find mention in our media system of these whistleblowers. They don't exist. If you read any article in the establishment media here in Europe or in the U.S. about the issue of chemical weapons in Syria, these OPCW whistleblowers and their leaks simply do not exist. And the reason is obvious. If you acknowledge their existence, you have to contend with their findings and their facts, and the facts can't be refuted, so therefore they're vetoed from history in very Orwellian fashion. That's what I can tell you about our propaganda system. I'd love to answer more questions if there are any when we do a Q&A. So thank you.
Okay. We will have one more speaker, and then we will have a very short pause, en kort pause, before we have our panel debate, because we have to do some setting up on stage here. It's my great pleasure to welcome someone I've known for a while now. He came all the way from Montreal to be with us today. Without any further ado, could you please welcome Yves Engler.
Thanks, Terrence, and thanks everyone for coming out. I had the opportunity today to check out your beautiful city. I don't know. I have to apologize off the bat. I don't know much about Norway. During most of my early days growing up as a hockey-obsessed person, a kid, my only real question about Norway was, why are you so good at the winter sports, but not the only sport that matters? Today I have maybe a more important question for you all, which is, how can you believe that your country is peaceful, progressive force when you're part of this militarist, imperialist NATO alliance? And that sort of gets at the question I'm getting at today with my political work, which is really about Canadian imperialism, Canadian Western imperialism. And what I want to talk about basically is that you have the authoritarian Trumpian imperialism, and you have the liberal imperialism, human rights rhetoric imperialism, but it's all the same bullshit. And that's the reality of it. And we're seeing that really clear. Aaron listed it off with what's going on in Gaza, but we're seeing this with this live-streamed Holocaust in Gaza. And our government, my government, the U.S. government, the leading supposed Biden administration, Mark Carney, liberal forces, they are backing this to the hilt. A couple months ago, I spent 5 days in jail because I criticized a Zionist influencer online. I responded to her racist, violent ex-posts by saying that she was supporting genocide in Gaza and the like. And the Montreal police said they were going to charge me for harassing this individual who I never met, never interacted with, just responded publicly, never threatened. And then when I wrote about the fact that I was going to be charged, and there was a letter campaign saying the police shouldn't arrest me, the Montreal police added 4 charges of harassing the Montreal police. And so I spent 5 days in jail, not anything to do with the charges against me, but just to be able to talk about the charges against me, specifically mention Dalia Kurtz, this person who I'm alleged to have harassed, a Zionist influencer, and I won that battle, but I still have all the charges pending. And this happens at a time that when they're going after me, and I'm just one example of dozens, hundreds of activists in Canada, and now we're seeing in the US, thousands, well, they don't even investigate Canadians, Montrealers, who are fighting in Gaza, who've been fighting in Gaza, who clearly are violating Canada's War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act. They don't investigate these institutions across Canada that are violating the Foreign Enlistment Act by inducing Canadians, oftentimes young Canadians, to join the Israeli military. Our government, the Canadian government, doesn't apply its own law around the International Arms Trade Treaty. We have specific legislation that says we can't sell weapons to countries that are violating human rights. Clearly, Israel's violating human rights. We have a system where we have hundreds of registered charities sending out $500 million a year to Israel, and a whole bunch of them support the Israeli military, support racist organizations, support West Bank settlements in clear violation of Canadian charity law. So we're subsidizing. But we have a situation where the Canadian government won't even uphold its own law, let alone international law, as we witness the slaughter, starvation taking place in Gaza. And these same people want to tell us that they're defending human rights and international law in Ukraine, right? and that we have to send billions and billions of dollars of weaponry for that purpose. And my question to Norwegian audience, how many Norwegian politicians are calling for arming the resistance in Gaza that's trying to defend international law? I'm guessing, I know in the Canadian context, I know in the US context, and other places in Western Europe, NATO countries, I'm guessing it's not that many. And so this is some of the context that I think is really important. On this Russia issue, Aaron's laid it out in a general sense. I'll bring in a bit of Canadian stuff in terms of what's happened there. Clearly, this is a provoked war. Clearly, NATO has been the aggressor geopolitically with regards to Russia. That's not a defense of what Russia's doing in Ukraine, right? This is not to defend the crimes that Putin bears responsibility for. You know, I believe in economic democracy. I believe in one person, one vote, not $1 one vote. I'm an internationalist. I don't share the same values as the leader of the Russian government. But there is a context here that is just completely wiped out in our dominant media. And when we talk about NATO expansion, this is not just sort of like idle threat. We have, since 2017, we have Canada leading a NATO mission in Latvia on Russia's border, you know, about 10,000 kilometers from Canada, right? We have Canadian troops since 2015, after the 2014 coup, training Ukrainians, hundreds of Canadians training Ukrainians to make them more interoperable with NATO. Right? We have the Canadian foreign minister in January 2022. She goes to Kyiv, and what does she do? Oh, yeah, we still want Ukraine to join NATO. When all that was playing out, she goes and further provokes the situation. Right? So there's all this context. Canada's role in the ouster of Yanukovych. Again, we're 10,000 kilometers away. Why was our foreign affairs minister during the Maidan? He went to Maidan Square during the protest. The foreign minister of Canada was at the Maidan Square protests. The embassy, the Canadian embassy in Kyiv, was used for a week as a place for the opposition, including the far right, C-14, to help overthrow the government. Again, we're 10,000 kilometers away. If you take Vancouver into it, it's probably more like 15,000 kilometers. So you know, how can this be justifiable? But all this it's easy to find this information online, but it's just wiped out. The dominant media just will not talk about that context. And oftentimes, when seeing propagandistic reports in the media, you ask yourself, with individual reporters, you say, are these people ignorant? Are they lazy? Or are they psychopaths? And it's hard to know, usually, right? A big picture we can know, but individually it's hard to know. But in one case, kind of the most senior military reporter at the CBC, which is the national broadcaster, Murray Brewster, it was really clear. Because Murray Brewster, who's written in the lead up to the Russian invasion in 2022, he wrote maybe dozens of stories about what was going on. And he never talked about the information he himself had already reported that was highly pertinent. He had reported the stuff I told you about the Canadian embassy being used as a bastion to overthrow Yanukovych back in 2015, 1 year after the coup. He reported on when it wasn't that sensitive, and certainly not as sensitive as the lead up to the invasion. He reported that Canada was training far-right forces in 2015, and before that, in 2008, he reported that Canada's push at the Bucharest summit on NATO, bringing Ukraine into NATO, that was resisted by Russia. So he knew all the context, but nothing. Doesn't report any of it. So we know he's not lazy, because the lazy thing to do would just be repeat what you've already reported when it mattered, when it had political weight. And we know he's not ignorant because he'd reported it. But so we know what he is, of course, is a sycophant of power. another part, I mentioned this, it's all bullshit, and I don't want to say this in a nihilistic way. I think there is a truth out there, and we can derive a truth, and there is good and evil, or at least better and less bad and stuff like that. But another element in the bullshit, and Aaron, I think, talked about this a little bit, is this notion of NATO as a defensive alliance, right? How about Yugoslavia in '99? Right? How about Afghanistan? How about Libya? Norway played a big role in dropping bombs on Libya, right? And look at what's just back in the, we don't hear anything about Libya, right? But every so often, little bits of news come out, and just the last couple of days, there's a whole bunch more killings in Libya. 14 years after we enforced the responsibility to protect, right? The response of this high-minded, liberal, imperialist doctrine, Libya is a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe. And the media, find media outlet that will talk about that role, that context to connect it to the NATO bombing, and a Canadian general led that NATO bombing. Now, I think that the most important question, the question of NATO, it's always been, it's never been defensive. It's never actually even been just about Russia. This has always been a belligerent alliance. And I apologize if I go back into a little bit of Canadian history on this, but I think it actually is relevant. The only Canadian to ever win that great prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, I went by the museum today, and I didn't know that Nobel was actually just, he was like sort of basically a arms runner who felt bad about being an arms runner and then set it out. I didn't know that, but anyway, but I think it was very apropos. And so the only Canadian to ever win that is Lester Pearson, who was a long-time external affairs diplomat, then external affairs minister, then becomes prime minister. And he was central. There are three countries that established NATO, the secret meetings in '48. Some people say NATO was a Canadian idea before that, but the three countries are US, Canada, and Britain, right? Which again, when you get into defensive, right? There's one country that could invade Canada, right? There's only one country, right? It's the one south of us. It's not, so the notion of Canada being in NATO as a defensive thing is just comical. In Norway, you can at least kind of make the case. In Canada, it's just a total joke. This is what Pearson said in March '49 in discussing the establishment of NATO. He said, quote, "The power of the communists, wherever that power flourishes, depends upon their ability to suppress and destroy the free institutions that stand against them. They pick them off one by one, the political parties, the trade unions, the churches, the schools, the universities, the trade associations, even the sporting clubs and the kindergartens. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is meant to be a declaration to the world that this kind of conquest from within will not in the future take place amongst us. The conquest from within is leftists' influence at kindergartens. Right? The one purpose of establishing NATO was as a tool to block the left, the communists, indigenous communists, Italy, specifically France, a bit across Western Europe. That was the Operation Gladio and all that stuff, right? Here you're talking about the conquest from within around kindergartens. The other purpose of the establishment of NATO, that element of NATO is much less relevant today. The other part is still highly relevant. The other purpose of establishing NATO was as a tool to reinforce European colonization and bring it under Washington-led geopolitical order. And Canada was a big supporter of that, of course. Very beneficial from a Canadian perspective. And so Lester Pearson was also very clear in the House of Commons repeatedly. There's no better way of ensuring the security of the Pacific Ocean, again, NATO, North Atlantic, at this particular moment than by working out between the great democratic powers a security arrangement, the effects of which will be felt all over the world, including the Pacific area. He says that about the Middle East, he says that about Asia. He justifies sending troops in the Korean War in 1950 through the lens of NATO, and we need to counter the Soviets. So NATO was always a tool of US-led global domination. And you still today with talk about China and NATO starting to turn towards China. So this is important part history with regards to NATO that I think is ignored, needs to be put forward very clearly. And I should say, at the time, in the 1950s, the main thing Canada did with NATO, besides sending troops here into Europe to try to stop the conquest from within, the socialists taking control of the kindergartens, the other thing they did was we put billions of dollars in weaponry to the French, while they were slaughtering in Vietnam and in Algeria, to the Belgians while they're suppressing independence in Congo, the British with the Kikuyu in Kenya, etc. So it was right off the bat. It was a tool of global domination, and yet we have this idea that it's defensive, that it's about protecting, and all this kind of stuff. And Canadians believe this liberal kind of claims. I did a book in 2016 called The Propaganda System, How Canada's Government, Corporations, Media and Academia Sell War and Exploitation. And it tried to answer this question, which is, why does the public so overwhelmingly believe that Canada is a force for good in the world when all the evidence suggests differently, certainly in the foreign policy evidence? And I think and I think there's maybe some parallel with Norway, where the public believes this, progressive kind of peace kind of rhetoric. Again, but part of this NATO militarist alliance. And so in the book, I mean, it goes into all kinds of details about how rich people set up university programs, rich people setting up think tanks, all different elements. Some of it's probably relevant, some of it's not relevant. I think the one point that I think is probably particularly relevant, I don't know, people can tell me, for the Norwegian context, is that the biggest public relations entity in Canada is the military. Okay, the military is hundreds and hundreds of full-time public relations people. It has its own university. It funds these security studies programs at other universities. It funds think tanks. It has this huge role in the propaganda system. And I'm guessing that's the case with Norway. And so we have a situation with NATO where NATO says we're going to spend a bunch more money in the military, and then there's more money for that institution to tell us that NATO is the greatest thing in the world. And so this is, I think, something that probably people in this audience know more about in the Norwegian context, and probably should explore more with regards to the propaganda system here. Yeah, the other part, in terms of, I think, understanding an element of the propaganda system, I think there's a domestic element. Obviously, there's the U.S. empire's huge presence in global media, and the role of the U.S. Government in funding different think tanks that push a pro-U.S. angle. I think that's something that people here know more about. And in the Canadian context, we have this whole kerfuffle around foreign interference, which is supposed to be Chinese interference. And the groups that are behind, the main group pushing this Chinese foreign interference, they list on their own website that they receive money from the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy to influence the Canadian Parliament. It's like literally on their website that their purpose is we're funded by the Americans to influence the Canadian Parliament, but the media, the reporters don't talk about that as foreign interference. And I know there's many different think tanks like that operating here in Norway. Now, I guess maybe sort of to move towards conclusion of Norway, the very little bit I know about Norway's role in the world. I came across a quote from Stoltenberg on October 12th, after Israel had already killed probably a couple thousand in Gaza, where he said that Israel does not stand alone. We know that NATO has an alliance, a sort of relationship, should I say, to Israel, which is continued as Israel's committing live stream Holocaust in Gaza, and Norway, of course, is part of this NATO military alliance that is the leading, that's a tool of the leading force of violence the world's probably ever seen, the U.S. Government. It doesn't seem to me you can be a force for good in the world when one of your big exports is Jens Stoltenberg. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yves. We are going to take a very brief pause, and I mean very, very brief,